Okay, so this is the first video of a series on the chemistry of life, or biochemistry, as I like to call it. So while these chemicals are not alive themselves, they are key components to all living things and are necessary to understand how living things function. Because biology is really, if you break it down, some people would argue that biology is simply chemistry that works in order to keep something alive. Um, that being said, let's go ahead and launch into 3.1, which is the chemical elements of water. And as you can see, 3.1.1, so we're just going to point one, is stating that the most frequently occurring chemical elements in living things are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. The way that I remember this, I still remember this from when I was taking IB biology, and I just remember this acronym, CHON. Um, it sounds funny. It resonates with me. Um, and knowing that C is carbon, sorry, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Sorry, I have a hard time writing this straight down. So CHON is a good way to remember that the four most common elements in living things is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And a good thing to remember as a side note is what the word organic means in terms of biology. Organic. Um, and really, what this means in terms of biology is that it contains carbon. But here's my question to you, and I think that you could do a little bit of research and figure this out. I expect you to, is know the difference between organic and inorganic compounds and decide whether or not carbon dioxide is an organic compound or not. And maybe what you need to do is first start figuring out what's the definition of a compound. Maybe that's something you remember from chemistry. Maybe that's something you need to look up. But I think you can answer this question is whether or not CO2 organic. Okay? I'm going to leave that up to you to figure out. All right, so that's all you need to know for point one. For point two is a little more difficult because it actually combines with point three. Point two says state that a variety of other elements are needed by living organisms, including sulfur, calcium, phosphorus, iron, and sodium. So there's a list that you can memorize. I'm going to go ahead and write down each one of these. Sulfur, we've got sulfur, calcium, phosphorus, iron, and sodium. Now, if you look in your textbook on page 53, there's a nice little chart there that gives you examples because what you need to do, in addition to stating that these are also important, not as common as these, but just as important, you also need to know the role of each of these elements, or one role for each of these elements. So if you look at the chart, there's an example in plant of how it works in plants, an example of how it works in animals, and an example of how it works in prokaryotes. And prokaryotes is another word for bacteria. So some of these are the same amongst all three types of organisms, and some of them are a little different. Um, and so I would start committing that chart to memory, but here's some key ones that you might know already um, just off the top of your head. Now, sulfur, you may or may not know, it, let's say, can be a component of amino acids, AA, amino acids. And if you remember, amino acids make proteins or polypeptides. Think back to the digestive unit. When we were talking about breaking down proteins, we break them into amino acids. Well, amino acids together make protein. And we'll talk more about how those get put together. But sulfur can be a component of that. Think about that smell of sulfur that you get sometimes with eggs. You smell it with eggs. And it's that sulfur that you smell in the protein of the eggs. And sometimes you have that same smell when maybe you're, especially for ladies, if you've straightened your hair and maybe let it let the straightener overheat in your hair, then what you're actually doing is burning the sulfur, and that's the smell that you are detecting. That smells so similar to rotten eggs. All right, for calcium, you need to know that it's a cofactor in some enzymes, that it's a component and a component of bones. But notice that your learning target says state one role for each of the elements. So you can say that calcium um, is a component or makes up. Actually, let's say component of, because there's other stuff. Component of bones in animals. In animals, okay? Phosphorus is used in the phosphate group, group of ATP. That's what the P stands for. It doesn't seem triphosphate. It's phosphate group, which contains a phosphorus atom. Iron. You probably know this already, that iron is in hemoglobin. And if you notice that the book spells a little different, they spell it the British way, either way is fine. But hemoglobin is the protein that makes up red blood cells. So iron is necessary for hemoglobin. Iron is actually what grabs the oxygen at the alveoli to transport it around your circulatory or transport system, and also where the carbon dioxide attaches to, so that from each cell, as a byproduct of cellular respiration, the hemoglobin or red blood cells can grab the carbon dioxide, take it around your body, back to the alveoli, so then you can exhale that carbon dioxide after gas exchange. Okay? So I hope that that's putting that into a little bit of context of what we've talked about so far, because that is fair game for any kind of assessment. And you notice in the book, it's also part of the cytochrome, which we may touch on this year. If you continue on to HL next year, college biology, you'll hear that word again. And then lastly, sodium is used, it says in membrane function, but also in nerve impulses, which I hope you see the automatic connection. Think to the sodium ions that we talked about on either side of an axon. As they move to send an action potential down the neuron, we're talking about sodium. And we need these things to send nerve impulses here, at least in animals, but they're used in membrane function in all living things. Okay, so that's point 1, point 2, point 3. All of this you need to start committing to memory. Some of this you might know already. So you might already know about sulfur, calcium, phosphorus, iron, and sodium from your content knowledge from 9th grade biology and or chemistry. Okay? All right, so let's move on to 3.1.4. I'm gonna see if I can, yep, that worked. Okay, so I'm gonna use a different color here because this is a different topic. Now we're talking about water. So I want you to make sure you're looking at your water POGL that we did in class. So for point 4, you needed to be able to draw and label water molecules to show their polarity and hydrogen bond formation. So you could simply do it the way that this diagram is in the book. That we've got, well, we have to remember that water is H2O. Students often make the mistake of saying HO2 or O2H or something like that. It's H2O, 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. So we've got our oxygen covalently bonded to a hydrogen, but that oxygen can make another covalent bond to another hydrogen, and here is our H2O molecule. Now this is just a diagram, which is perfectly fine. And then based on what we know about electron distribution, we know that there are more electrons around, and you can look at model 1 in your POGL, there are more electrons around the oxygen than there are the hydrogens, which means that if the oxygen is relatively negative, compared to the positive end of the hydrogen, making this whole thing a polar molecule, okay? Because there are two ends, even though overall this molecule is neutral. What we know is that because of this polarity, there's an interesting phenomenon that happens. This dotted line represents a weak attraction to another water molecule, which we're going to represent here. And I'm just using the same diagram that's in your textbook. But notice that I didn't draw this exactly the same. So let me fix that. So I'm going to cross that out and put the negative here. It's not actually the oxygen and the hydrogens that are bonding. It's the relative negative side of one water molecule bonding to the relative positive end of another water molecule. So the hydrogens are the positive. So this is just a diagram to show that connection. But remember that water, I'm going to make a couple notes and say how this model, let me write it this way. Limitations to this model. One, we know that water can make 4 hydrogen bonds especially when we're talking about cohesion or water sticking to each other. And here we're only representing it as 1, and that, yeah, so that's really the main connection here. So the main limitation here, because if we have a lot more water molecules, we can see a lot more connections to make a tighter fit. And that's really the key here, but let me just double check. We showed their polarity and hydrogen bond formation. We know a lot more about hydrogen bonds now that we've done the POGIL, which is going to help us with the next section, which is point 5. Sorry, let me label this as point 4. Point 5 is to outline the thermal, cohesive, and solvent properties of water. Okay, so I think I have space to do that down here. So I'm going to write each term. So thermal, cohesive, and solvent. Okay, so let's add a few notes down here below. For the thermal properties, one thing that we know is that there's high specific heat, which simply means, without going into too much detail about this, that it takes a lot of energy for water to heat up. And the reason for that is because there are lots of, and you should know this reason, there are lots of hydrogen bonds. If there's a lot of hydrogen bonds between water, even though they're weak and they can break easily, they're also very easy to form. So think about those magnetic water molecules in my hands as I was moving them back and forth. They were breaking hydrogen bonds, creating new ones, and so it takes a lot of energy to move those water molecules far enough away from each other that they don't make new hydrogen bonds. And that's what the high specific heat is. So it takes a lot of energy to do that, which is a really good thing for living things, and we'll get to that in the next section. Okay, so obviously I've just written one thing down here, but I talked for a little while about what's going on here with high specific heat. Cohesion is when one water molecule bonds to another, but there's a very, very important feature of cohesion that we talk about often, and that's surface tension. And we talked about this in class as well. And this is because the water molecules stick to each other, but at the surface, there are no water molecules above the molecules at the surface. And therefore, they can't create the hydrogen bonds that they need to or would create if they were submerged in water and other water molecules. So instead of not creating any hydrogen bonds above them, what they do instead is create more hydrogen bonds to the molecules next to them and underneath them. And by doing so, they create this, they create tighter bonding, which makes it more like a solid, which is exactly what you feel when you do a belly flop. You feel like you hit something solid, And in a way you kind of have, because the water molecules are so tightly bonded with all the extra hydrogen bonds, that it feels like a solid. And then lastly, a solvent. The hydrogen bonds, again, create a polar molecule, and by doing so, they can dissociate. They can dissociate lots of molecules. Not all, but lots of molecules. And so sometimes we say that it's a universal solvent, which is a good thing for living things, which we'll get to in just a minute when we talk about, and we're going to do this right now, point 6, which is to explain the relationship between the properties of water and its uses in living organisms as a coolant, medium for metabolic reactions, and transport medium. Okay, so let's talk about its uses for living things as a coolant. Well, it's good for temperature control. So what that really means is that it creates a stable environment. So imagine a lake or a pond that changed its temperature very, very quickly in response to air temperature. Well, that would mean that all the organisms that live in the water would have to be able to continue their metabolism in that changing environment, and that's not a good thing. So that's very difficult to do. So the water provides that kind of buffer to the temperature because of the hydrogen bonding. There's a high specific heat, so the temperature of water changes very, very slowly over time, and so that allows for organisms to continue to metabolize their food, their nutrients, and survive. Okay, and I would jot all that down. Okay, you need as a medium for metabolic reactions and a transport medium. Well, that all really comes back to the solvent, because water is a polar molecule. It transports all kinds of molecules to cells, away from cells, and allows them to do metabolism and transport things. But the transport medium can kind of fall into the solvent because it moves into the solvent idea that we've been talking about, because it moves things from molecule to molecule, from cell to cell, or from the environment to the cell, or away from the cell. But as a transport medium, we talked a little bit about this in class with the capillary action. Let's see. Okay, so when we're talking about water moving up a plant, a vascular plant, up to the leaves to do photosynthesis, it's going to do that because of the cohesive and also the adhesive properties of water. So it can actually move up a plant against gravity, which is interesting. So when you think about, are hydrogen bonds do hydrogen bonds have more force than gravity but all it is hydrogen bonds that move water up a plant against gravity? Interesting question. I'll let you figure out the answer to that. And if you have questions about that, please write them down in class. Okay? And I think that covers us for 3.1. I'm putting up sample questions up on Blackboard that have to do with this material, so you can test yourself. But I hope that you took notes and that you have questions that you wrote down as well, so you can ask them to me in class, and I can follow up by answering those questions for you. Okay? So that finishes us out for 3.1.